Well, welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, or as I should say more correctly, my name is Jeff Short. Pastor is a title. I had a viewer send me a message and say, Pastor, you are using that term, that phrase incorrectly. You're actually saying that your name is Pastor Jeff Short by saying my name is Pastor Jeff Short, and you need to correctly say my name is Jeff Short, but pastor is my title. So for that viewer, for those who are bothered by my use of the English language, I will say, hello, my name is Pastor. My title is Pastor. My name is Jeff. My last name is Short, Jeff Short. So anyway, thank you. I will try to adhere to that rule and be more accurate in my speech. The topic today in Christian Answers is, does Martin Luther, do the Reformers have to be saints in order to count for anything? The reason this question came up was because I was listening to a podcast by Dr. Taylor Marshall, who is a Catholic theologian, and Timothy Gordon, who is also a Catholic theologian. And these two men have a podcast and they discuss issues in the Catholic Church. And the topic of Martin Luther came up. And Timothy Gordon had recently seen a documentary put out by a Polish production company about Martin Luther. And I guess from the talking of these two men, this documentary is really, really powerfully damaging against Martin Luther. It shows some things that they claim that Martin Luther said or Martin Luther did that would then discredit him or would bring him down in his fame, would defame him. And they were happy about this because they don't like Martin Luther because he led the revolution, as they call it. Instead of the Reformation, they call it a revolution. And they see Martin Luther and the Reformers as bad guys instead of actual church reformers who brought necessary rebuke of the corrupt Catholic hierarchy of the 1600s, 16th century, 1500s. So the question is, does Martin Luther or John Calvin or any of the reformers, do they have to be saints to count for anything and to have a prophetic voice? And the answer is no, they don't have to be saints. In the Roman Catholic Church, the famous people in the history of the church are often made saints. And then they are not only simply heroes to be looked up to or role models to be followed, they're actually saints, and you can actually pray to them and ask for their intercession, which is totally non-biblical. There is nothing in the New Testament that describes anything remotely like asking someone who has died to pray for you, or asking someone who has died to help you. Nothing in the New Testament that describes anything like that. And yet, the Roman Catholic Church has this tradition of asking for the intercession of the saints. And so the people who are made into heroes in the Roman Catholic Church and who are sainted, they have to be totally immaculate in their character. They have to be above reproach. They have to be perfect, near perfect, because they not only are role models, they're people that people today might pray to. And not only that, they're people in heaven today that can also share their holiness with other people in the form of indulgence. So you have this whole theology of saints. So the heroes of the Roman Catholic Church, they have to live up to these high standards, and if there's anything that might besmirch that character, that has to be suppressed, that has to be hidden, that has to be kept down, because you can't have a saint that is exposed to anything bad. But in the Roman Catholic system, that's a false system. the system of saints and the saint making and so forth, this is all outside of the Bible. It's all human tradition. It's all man-made tradition. In Protestantism, we don't have to have our reformers as immaculate. We don't have to have John Calvin, for example, as perfect in all of his ways, or Martin Luther in all of his ways has to be the role model for everyone for all time. No. We can accept that these men have flaws. We can accept that Martin Luther had salty language. We can accept that Martin Luther was kind of coarse in his speech, that he wasn't always polite, that he wasn't always jovial, that he always wasn't the gentleman that you might imagine. Even though we respect him and his prophetic message, we're not looking to him to intercede for us. He doesn't have to sit in heaven and receive prayers from people on earth and then intercede to the Father on their behalf, like in the Roman Catholic system, and how they exalt their saints. We don't have any of that because it's not biblical. It's not according to the will of God as revealed in the Bible. And so when we look upon a Martin Luther, and if some of the things that the Polish documentary that Timothy Gordon was describing are true, that actually happened to Martin Luther, then we would simply say that is believable, and we certainly don't want to follow in his footsteps in that area, but we still recognize what he said about salvation by faith alone, his theology, what he found in the Bible, in the book of Romans, by the Apostle Paul, that faith saves us, faith without works. We can appreciate his rediscovery of that famous and important gospel-centered message is still valid. Whether Martin Luther was this perfect example of Christian or not. It doesn't matter if he was or not. Now, I slipped there and I almost said Martin Luther King, and it's incredible. If you want to do any research on Martin Luther, if you want to do any kind of research on the Reformers, and you type in Martin Luther, you probably will have to scroll through about 3 or 4 pages before you even get to Martin Luther, the Reformer, the famous history-changing figure, because you have to go through 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 pages of Martin Luther King. So as far as proportionality is concerned, you would think that Martin Luther King was this greater than ever history-shaping individual based on the proportionality of the articles and the hits that come up immediately when you type in Martin Luther. You would think that he is the greater of the two, but in fact, if you look back in history, Martin Luther, the Reformer, is far more important and far more influential and is a far more greater key figure in historical perspective than Martin Luther King. And that just shows you that we have to be careful when we look at the internet. We have to not take it as seriously as it takes itself. Because if you type in Google, the search engine, you're going to get all kinds of information on Martin Luther King when you're really looking for Martin Luther, the Reformer. And it gives you a kind of a perspective on where Google and the internet is right now. There isn't you cannot necessarily trust Google to give you a priority search result. That's kind of scary because we depend on that so much today, and young people especially. That's unquestioned. You just type in something, and all of a sudden come up these entries into this search that you make. Well, the question is, how valid are those entries? And how significant are those entries? And are the important entries that should be there, are they there? Or is there more of a weighted, sort of a biased search engine that you're using? And we definitely see in this case that it is, because of the abundance of information on Martin Luther King. And then you have to scroll down a number of different pages to get something on actually the Martin Luther, the man from whom Martin Luther King is named. So you have to really dig down deep to find anything for the very man that Martin Luther King is named after. So it's very dangerous. But back to the point, Taylor Marshall, Timothy Gordon are talking about Luther disparagingly, and they're acting like his message is invalidated by something he might have done. Now, what is it that he might have done that Timothy Gordon and Taylor Marshall were talking about? Well, in this Polish documentary, there is the claim that Martin Luther, the reformer, when he was a young man, actually participated in a duel with another young man and shot and killed the other man. And the reason that he entered into the monastery to begin with and became a priest, and a monk more specifically, is because he was fleeing from the authorities on the charges of murder. And so he entered into the monastery to get away from that town. And this is strange because I've studied seminary. I went to seminary at some of the finest institutions in our country. I went to one of the best evangelical Bible-believing colleges in the nation, Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. It's always top-ranked as a liberal arts academic institution. Studied history there and theology there. And then I went up the street to in the northern parts of Illinois, to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, another famous Bible-believing evangelical Christian seminary, and graduated with a Master of Divinity there, and took church history and learned all about the Reformation. And then I went and completed a doctorate at Fuller Theological Seminary, at one time the world's largest seminary, and completed that doctorate and learn more about theology and history. And never one time in all of my studies, and I've read many, many books on church history, never one time did I ever encounter the allegation that Martin Luther killed a man, and that's why he went into the monastery that started his career as a monk. Never heard that story, never heard any account of that. And now there's a Polish documentary that says that Martin Luther, as a motivation for entering seminary, now we have always heard that he was walking across the field and it started raining and it started thundering and lightning, and he was nearly hit by lightning. And at that moment of terror that you can imagine, if you're walking through an open field and lightning strikes nearby, you're afraid for your life. And in that moment, he cried out and he said he would become a monk. He cried to God. Actually, as a Roman Catholic, he supposedly cried out to Saint Anne, which is one of the saints in the corpus of saints that the Roman Catholic Church has, and he cried out to Saint Anne that he would become a monk. Now, then he entered monastery. But according to this Polish documentary, no, don't believe all that. It was because he had murdered a man and he was fleeing to try to escape the consequences of that. Well, to show that, you would have to really come up with some solid sources. And that is very, very questionable. Very, very questionable. There are some other allegations against Martin Luther that all depend on certain hearsay and certain secondhand reports about something he said. Allegedly, and Roman Catholic apologists are quick to pounce on this and say, see, this shows you this guy wasn't a very good guy. Allegedly, he said that Mary and Jesus had some kind of a romantic relationship going on. He didn't say it in any of his official writings, and supposedly it occurred at the dinner table during one of his table talks, his famous table talks, and a student heard him say it, or some student heard another student say he heard it, and so forth. So it's kind of a second-hand report that Martin Luther said something about Mary Magdalene and Jesus having some kind of a romantic relationship. Now, the question has to be asked, what was the context? Was it in sarcasm? Was it sort of a light-hearted comment? Was it done in a joking manner? Was he actually teaching that? And what was his evidence? And it's hard to say. And so you really have to weigh the sources of where you're getting this information. But even if he did say something like that, would that nullify his arguments against the corruption in the Roman Catholic Church? No, it would not. Would that detract from any of his theological writings on salvation by faith alone? No, it's not. See, in other words, what are the strengths of his arguments in those theological issues? Not what did he might have said here, or what did he might have done here or there or there. These things are not important to the Reformers. These things were not important to Calvin. In fact, there were times in Calvin's own personal letters, John Calvin, the second generation Reformer, he commented on Luther and Luther's personality. And he said something to the effect that sometimes Brother Luther can be a little overbearing, or something to that effect, that Luther sometimes comes across very boorish. And Calvin was the other extreme. He was this scholar, this academic, this polite, genteel, gentleman kind of classic scholar. And Luther was not that. But Luther had a great intellect. Now, Luther's criticisms of the Roman Catholic corruption of his time are still valid no matter what Luther did. It would be the same way with such a person as, for example, his namesake, Martin Luther King. Allegedly, Martin Luther King was a womanizer. Martin Luther King was immoral. He was an adulterer, serial adulterer. He was corrupt in his personal private life. That's according to Ralph Abernathy and some of his other companions. So we can see that Martin Luther King was not a saint by any stretch of the imagination. Now, does that nullify all of his civil rights arguments? I mean, he made some arguments about why all races should be treated equal. And he pointed to the Constitution, he pointed to the founding documents of our country. He essentially made arguments that people listened to and had to deal with. Now, does the private life of Martin Luther King take away the weight of those arguments? Can we say, we don't have to listen to Martin Luther King's arguments against prejudice and racism and unequal treatment in the South and so on and so forth? We don't have to pay any attention to that because Martin Luther King was out cheating on his wife and so on and so forth. There are white supremacists that want to do that. They want to say, we can't believe anything Martin Luther King says. He's totally discredited. His arguments are invalid because he was a womanizer. He was cheating on his wife. He was a corrupt individual and so on and so forth. No, those arguments against Martin Luther King and his arguments against racism are invalid because he made his points and they weren't dependent upon his own personal life. He didn't have to be a saint. He didn't have to be someone with an impeccable background or character. He didn't have to do that. It's the same way with Martin Luther King. His arguments stand alone, apart from anything that he said or did. Now, Martin Luther King, we know also now, according to his records, that he was a plagiarist. He copied great sections of his doctoral thesis from other men. We know that because we can set these other men's writings right next to Martin Luther King's doctoral thesis and see how he copied verbatim their own ideas. Okay, so he was a adulterer and he was a cheater on his doctoral thesis, plagiarist, and so on and so forth. Okay, does that take away his work in bringing about integration and ending of the discriminatory laws in the South? Does that take away from his civil rights activity? No, it doesn't. It doesn't take away from his civil rights activity. It might take away from the idea that you need to make him as a role model for young people in society, because he wasn't a very moral man in his own personal life. But as far as his arguments against discrimination, racism, he did a great service to our country by reminding us that we need to treat all people equally because all men are created in the image of God. And so he's kind of reminding us what we already knew really instinctively and from the Bible, that we need to treat all men equally. And that's also in our Constitution, so he called us back to our own founding documents, so on and so forth. So his civil rights record stands on its own, apart from his own personal life. Martin Luther, similarly, if some of these allegations are true, for example, like he was in a duel and he killed a man, if that's true, and I highly doubt that because of the paucity of sources and the scarcity of reliable evidences for that, but if it is true, would that take away from his criticisms of the Roman Catholic Church and the corruption in the church at the time? No, it wouldn't. And would that take away also from his theological insights and writings based on the Bible about justification by faith alone? No, it wouldn't. There were all other things that we know for sure that are documented that are negative against Martin Luther, and one is his anti-Semitism. Toward the end of his life, he gave some sermons and some teachings that were anti-Jewish, that he railed against Jews. He blamed them for not receiving Jesus, and he disparaged them in many different ways. And some of those, unfortunately, some of those writings of Martin Luther were used later on by the Nazis and Hitler as justification for ill treatment of the Jews, which is a travesty. It's sad. It's a tragedy. And that's unfortunate that that happened. Now, do those anti-Semitic rantings of an older Martin Luther at the end of his life, do those take away from the criticism that Martin Luther leveled against the Roman Catholic Church as far as its corruption and its false doctrine and its theological heterodoxy? No, it doesn't. It does not take away one bit, because those arguments stand alone on their own. The same way with John Calvin. John Calvin was not a perfect individual. In fact, he was willing, the biggest criticism of John Calvin, he was willing to use the sword to put down false teaching. There was a man named Michael Servetus, and he taught against the Trinity, and he came into Geneva, where Calvin was the official teacher of the Christian faith in Geneva, Switzerland, and Calvin permitted him to be arrested and permitted him to be executed on the grounds of heresy. He was a false teacher. He's corrupting the minds and hearts and spiritual lives of people in the area. Now, Servetus was a wanted man both by Roman Catholics and by Protestant groups for his false teachings against the Trinity, for example. Now, today, by today's standards, we would say Calvin was harsh. We would say Calvin was a bigot or a religious imperialist, because he was putting people to death for their convictions, false religious convictions. And today we would not do that. We'd never, in the United States, for example, put someone to death for their disbelief of the Christian Trinity. But back then it was a different context, different setting. This was done everywhere, at all places. And so Calvin was a part of that culture, and people saw nothing wrong with putting a heretic to death. Now, does that take away from Calvin's teachings about the Christian faith? Does that take away from his teachings found in his famous book, The Calvin's Institutes? No, it does not take away from the teachings, because those arguments, those teachings stand on their own. As Protestants, we don't look to John Calvin as someone who reveals something new from God. We're looking to him to expound the Bible. Same way with Martin Luther King. Excuse me, again, I made the mistake. Martin Luther, the Reformer. His arguments on justification by faith, his exegesis, as we call it, or exposition of the Scriptures, are either solid or they're not. And if you read through his arguments, you either understand his arguments and agree with the arguments, or you don't. It doesn't have anything to do with his personality. It doesn't have anything to do with his personal life. So Taylor Marshall, Timothy Gordon, in trying to discredit the Reformation by pointing out maybe faults and flaws in the Reformers, does not discredit the Reformation. The Reformation does not stand on the personalities of the Reformers. It stands on their arguments and their thinking and their reasoning from Scripture. Contrary to the Roman Catholic Church, which depends on and is linked to the supposed holiness of these saints. We don't have saints in the Protestant Church. We don't need saints. The Bible doesn't tell us that we need saints. In fact, the Bible in the New Testament says that once you're in Christ, once you've been redeemed, regenerated by the Holy Spirit, once you've been born again, you are a saint. And so you don't need someone to intercede in heaven for you called a saint. You are a saint, and you can pray directly to Christ, who is the mediator between God and man. So I hope that that has helped and cleared some up, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.